I think a lot of people are probably most familiar with the Cameron Todd Willingham case out of Texas because Todd was executed, and after he was executed by Texas, reports started coming out that the science used at his trial to say that this fire was set, that it was intentional, have completely been disproven. And so it's another timeline type question. In the 80s and 90s, the people that investigate fires have a high school diploma usually, and then they start on as a firefighter, and they work their way up to become an investigator. And there wasn't textbooks, and there wasn't trainings. It was you learned from the people above you, and they taught you what they knew. And a lot of myths developed where fire investigators believed that if you saw spalled concrete or crazed glass, where the glass is kind of shattered into lots of, it's not broken, but it's got lots of spider cracks through it, that was a sign of an accelerant being used, such as gasoline or something like that, and that meant arson. An accidental fire was believed to not burn very fast. And slowly, scientists, men with PhDs that studied explosions and fires, and they started trying to replicate some of these artifacts that were found at fire scenes. And they learned that crazed glass is created when you heat up glass and you spray it with cold water. No accelerant necessary. And yet that, investigators were seeing that and automatically jumping to the conclusion that this was an arson, this was an accelerant, this was an incendiary fire because we see this. And they also, if a fire was fast, if it burned, had deep amounts of char, those types of physical findings, without necessarily corroborating that with a lab report, if an accelerant like gasoline really is being poured throughout a living room or a trailer, you should find traces of that in the carpet samples or in the flooring or somewhere. And in most of these arson cases, they either didn't do any lab testing, or the testing was inaccurate, or there is no accelerant. So there's nothing to support these physical findings, and then there's no body of science that would confirm or say, yes, this is caused by gasoline, this is caused by an accelerant. And in the early 90s, some of these scientists started getting together, and they started putting out a manual on how to investigate fires. And it's the National Fire Protection Association, and the manual, every couple of years, they update it. And now, just recently, in the late 2000s, they have put in the manual that you must use a scientific method. And so hopefully everybody who went through, high school science is familiar with the scientific method. You develop a hypothesis and you test it. And if you can't support it, then you haven't proven your hypothesis. It's not true. And you can't say it's true. You can't accept it as a fact. And there's been a lot of resistance in the fire community. They like their myths. They like their way of doing things. And a lot of them don't have the scientific training or background to understand the physics of fire. I mean, fire involves gas and reactions, and it's much more scientific and complicated than a high school education. It can really, if you think about how a fire grows in a confined space and how it reacts with other chemicals that are in your couch cushions and in the carpet and the drywall and the insulation, and how and when it burns and how fast it burns, all of that has to do with the chemistry of it. And high school chemistry is not enough to make you an expert, to give an opinion on it. One of the major changes to the manual is the elimination of negative corpus. Negative corpus basically is, if you rule everything else out, then it must be incendiary. So they would go through and try to rule out every accidental cause. They check all the appliances. They talk about cigarettes. They, look for anything that, a candle, anything that might have accidentally caused this fire. If none of those are determined to be in the origin where they think the fire started, then by negative corpus, by default, it must have been incendiary, because they can't find any other explanation for it. The manual now says that you can't use negative corpus, that it has to be undetermined, and the ATF actually has the best research showing that just by choosing the origin of the fire based on the greatest amount of damage done or the deepest level of char, you're wrong 1 in 4 times. That the most amount of damage is not a reliable indicator that that's where the fire started. That might be where there was the most oxygen. It might be where there was the most combustible material, perhaps a polyurethane cushion on a couch, but it's not necessarily the origin. And so a lot of investigators have picked their origin erroneously, and then they can't find the cause because they're looking in the wrong spot. And then they come up with it must be incendiary because perhaps there's no electrical outlet there. It's the middle of the room, or there's nothing that they can find. We've been gathering affidavits explaining the evolution of the science, explaining what opinions are now based on the new research, the new manual, the new guidelines, and hopefully that will be enough new evidence of actual innocence to get a hearing. There's a case out of Michigan, or I think Michigan, where they took a look at it and none of their fire experts from the original trial would back up what they testified to in the 90s, and so they dismissed the charges. And so, you know, it's one of those kind of slow things where the community is reluctant to change, but it is changing. And we've got all these people convicted of arson and murder on the old, outdated science, and it's going to be a long process to find the cases where the outdated methods were used and where the person's innocent.